It was a chilly autumn morning in 1993 when Jennifer and David Calloway awoke to a nightmare. Their 6-month-old baby, Emily, was gone. Her crib was empty, the window slightly open, and the front door unlocked. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransom note, and no witnesses. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Police launched a massive search effort in their quiet town of Riverside, California. Detectives questioned neighbors, checked security footage from local stores, and even looked into the parents. Jennifer and David were devastated but cooperative. They pleaded on live television, their tear-streaked faces haunting the news cycle for weeks. Despite their efforts, months passed with no trace of Emily. Then years. The case went cold. In 2018, exactly 25 years after Emily's disappearance, a detective named Sarah Monroe received an anonymous tip. A woman in Austin, Texas, who had grown up believing she was adopted, had started to question her origins. The caller said the woman, now 26 years old, had an unusual birthmark on her left wrist, the same one that baby Emily had. Detective Monroe reopened the case and tracked the woman down. She was living under the name Melissa Grant and had no memory of being kidnapped. A DNA test was conducted, and the results left investigators stunned. Melissa Grant was, in fact, Emily Calloway. Melissa had been raised by a woman named Catherine Willis, who claimed she had legally adopted her through a private agency. But when police dug into Catherine's past, they uncovered something disturbing. She had changed her name in 1994, a year after Emily's disappearance. Before that, she had a different identity. Detective Monroe pressed Melissa for details about her upbringing. The young woman recalled strange events from her childhood, a locked room she wasn't allowed in, late-night conversations she wasn't supposed to hear, and a man named Uncle Victor, who disappeared when she was a teenager. As police intensified their investigation, they discovered something even more chilling. Catherine Willis wasn't working alone. Someone else had orchestrated the entire abduction, and that person was still out there. Just as the truth was unraveling, Catherine Willis was found dead in her home. The cause? A single gunshot wound to the chest. But there were no signs of forced entry. No sign of a struggle. And no weapon near the body. Melissa was closer than ever to uncovering her past, but now, the one person who could give her answers was gone. Who had taken baby Emily? Why was Catherine murdered? And what dark secret had been buried for 30 years? Detective Sarah Monroe stood in Catherine Willis's dimly lit living room, staring at the body. There was no gun, no forced entry, and no sign of struggle. It was as if Catherine had been executed, silently and efficiently. The forensics team worked fast. Fingerprints, fibers, any sign of who had been there last. But Monroe had a gut feeling. Catherine hadn't been working alone, and whoever was pulling the strings just made sure she'd never talk. Melissa, formerly Emily Calloway, was in shock. The woman who had raised her wasn't her real mother, but she was the only mother she had ever known. And now she was dead. She had secrets, Melissa whispered. I don't think she ever wanted to tell me the truth. The name Uncle Victor stuck in Monroe's mind. Melissa had mentioned him as a shadowy figure from her past, someone who had disappeared when she was a teenager. Who was he? And why had he vanished? Digging through Catherine's records, Monroe found something bizarre. Before changing her name, Catherine had been married. Her husband? Victor Langley. But there was one major problem. Victor Langley had been declared dead in 1995. Monroe ordered the case files on Victor Langley's death. According to the report, he had died in a car accident. His vehicle had gone off a bridge into the Mississippi River, but his body had never been recovered. At the time, authorities assumed it had been swept away by the currents. Now, Monroe wasn't so sure. Was Victor Langley really dead? Or had he faked his own death to cover up the kidnapping? A background check revealed that Victor had once been involved in black market adoptions. He and Catherine had been suspected of illegally selling infants to desperate couples who couldn't adopt through legal channels. But there had never been enough evidence to charge them. If Victor was still alive, that meant one thing: he had been involved in Emily's kidnapping. And now, after 30 years, he might be trying to cover his tracks. The night after Catherine's murder, Monroe's phone rang. It was a blocked number. She answered, expecting a tip or a witness. Instead, a distorted voice whispered, "You're getting too close." Then the call disconnected. Monroe felt a chill run down her spine. Whoever had taken Emily 30 years ago was still out there. And they weren't done yet. Detective Sarah Monroe barely flinched as Victor Langley, now known as Vincent, leaned back in his leather chair, a knowing smirk spreading across his face. He knew exactly why she was there. "You've been looking for me," he said, folding his hands on the desk. "I have to admit, Detective, I'm impressed. Not many people get this far." Monroe kept her expression neutral. "Why don't we cut the act? Emily Calloway. Catherine Willis. The fake adoption ring. I have enough evidence to bury you." Victor let out a small chuckle. "Do you? Or do you just think you do?" He was confident, too confident. Monroe had spent years chasing criminals, and she knew when someone still had an ace up their sleeve. Meanwhile, Melissa was growing more paranoid. The text message warning her to stop digging was just the beginning. She had the uneasy feeling she was being watched. One night, as she returned to her apartment, she noticed her door was slightly ajar. Her heart pounded. She was certain she had locked it. Slowly, she pushed the door open. Nothing seemed out of place, until she spotted a single photograph sitting on her kitchen counter. It was a picture of her as a baby. The same missing person photo that had been circulated when she was kidnapped. Scrawled across it in red ink were the words, "You were never supposed to come back." Melissa stumbled backward, grabbing her phone to call Monroe. But before she could dial, she heard movement behind her. Back in New Orleans, Monroe wasn't getting the answers she wanted from Victor Langley. He was dodging her questions, acting like he had nothing to hide. But then, his phone rang. For the first time, Monroe saw something that resembled fear flash across his face. He stared at the number for a moment before silencing it and slipping the phone into his pocket. Monroe leaned forward. "Who was that, Victor?" Silence. Then, Victor sighed. "I think it's time you leave, Detective." Monroe knew she had struck a nerve. She stood up but kept her voice calm. "You're running out of time. You might think you're untouchable, but secrets don't stay buried forever." As she walked out of his office, she sent a message to her team. "Trace Victor Langley's last incoming call. Now." She was about to uncover the final piece of the puzzle. But was she already too late? Melissa's breath hitched as she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around, but before she could react, a gloved hand clamped over her mouth. She struggled, kicking wildly, but the attacker was strong. A deep voice whispered in her ear, "You should have stopped asking questions." Melissa's survival instincts kicked in. She bit down hard on the attacker's hand, causing him to curse and loosen his grip. She took the opportunity to grab the nearest object, a heavy glass candle holder, and smashed it into his face. The man staggered back, giving Melissa just enough time to bolt out of the apartment. She sprinted down the hallway, not daring to look back. As she reached the parking lot, she fumbled for her car keys, her hands shaking. But before she could get inside, a black SUV screeched to a stop in front of her. The passenger door swung open, revealing Detective Monroe. "Get in," she shouted. Melissa didn't hesitate. She dove into the car just as Monroe slammed the gas pedal, tires screeching. "Who the hell was that?" Melissa panted, gripping the dashboard. Monroe's face was grim. "Someone who really doesn't want us to find out the truth." The trace leads to a shocking name. Back at the station, Monroe's team had finally traced the last incoming call to Victor Langley's phone. The number was registered to an offshore account, but after digging deeper, they found something shocking. The real name behind the account? David Calloway. Melissa's biological father. Monroe's stomach twisted. David and Jennifer Calloway had spent 30 years grieving their missing child. They had pleaded on television. They had demanded justice. So why was David Calloway connected to the man who had stolen Melissa? And worse, was Jennifer involved too? Melissa sat in Monroe's office, staring at the name on the file. "This has to be a mistake," she whispered. "My father wouldn't, he couldn't." Monroe's voice was gentle but firm. "We don't know anything for sure yet. But we do know he's hiding something." Melissa felt sick. She had spent years longing to reunite with her parents. Now, doubt crept into her mind. Had they been part of this all along? Meanwhile, Monroe received a call from her team. They had obtained old financial records showing that in the months leading up to Emily's disappearance, David Calloway had received multiple large deposits into his bank account, from an account linked to Victor Langley. The evidence was stacking up. Confrontation at the Calloway house. Monroe and Melissa drove to the Calloway home. Jennifer answered the door, her face lighting up when she saw Melissa. "Oh my God, sweetheart." She pulled her into a tight embrace. Melissa hesitated. "Mom. I need to ask you something." Before she could continue, David appeared in the doorway. His expression turned cold the moment he saw Monroe. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tight. Monroe crossed her arms. "We need to talk, Mr. Calloway." David's jaw tensed. "Not without my lawyer." Melissa's heart sank. "Dad, what did you do?" Jennifer turned to her husband, confusion and fear on her face. "David." Before he could answer, a loud bang shattered the moment. A single gunshot. David collapsed onto the porch, blood spreading across his shirt. From the street, a black SUV sped away. Melissa screamed. Monroe grabbed her radio. "Officer down. We need backup now." David gasped for air, his hands trembling as he reached for Melissa. With his last breath, he choked out 2 words. "I'm sorry." Paramedics worked desperately to save David Calloway, but it was too late. He was gone. Melissa stood frozen in shock. Who would do this? Monroe was already moving. The same people who didn't want us asking questions. But there was still one person who could answer them. Jennifer Calloway. Back inside the house, Jennifer sat in stunned silence, her hands trembling. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear, I didn't know." Monroe leaned in. "Then tell us everything you do know." "No more running." Detective Monroe tightened her grip on her phone as she stared at the threatening text. "You found out too much. You're next." Victor Langley wasn't just cleaning up loose ends, he was making a statement. Melissa, still shaken from her father's murder, turned to Monroe. "What do we do now?" Monroe made a decision. "We stop playing defense. We take the fight to Victor." Monroe had one shot at catching Langley. She arranged a fake meeting, an opportunity for Victor to negotiate his escape in exchange for money and silence. The meeting place? An abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Houston. Melissa insisted on coming. "This is my life," she argued. "I need to see him face to face." Monroe hesitated, but she knew Melissa was right. The warehouse showdown. Night fell. Monroe and Melissa arrived at the warehouse first, armed with a hidden recording device and a team of undercover officers stationed nearby. Minutes later, headlights sliced through the darkness. A sleek black car pulled up, and Victor Langley stepped out. He was calm. Too calm. "Detective Monroe," he greeted, smirking. "And Melissa. Or should I say, Emily?" Melissa clenched her fists. "Why did you take me?" Victor tilted his head. "Because I could." Before Monroe could respond, a second car pulled up. The doors flew open, armed men stepped out. Victor smiled. "You didn't think I'd come alone, did you?" The trap Monroe's
had backfired.
instincts screamed danger. The armed men had positioned themselves strategically, blocking any easy escape. Melissa's pulse pounded. She wasn't just scared, she was furious. "You ruined my life," she spat. Victor sighed. "I didn't ruin it, dear. I gave you a different one." Monroe's patience snapped. "Put your hands where I can see them, Langley." Victor smirked. "Oh, detective. I don't take orders." Then, gunfire. Monroe tackled Melissa behind a stack of crates as bullets tore through the warehouse. Glass shattered. Sparks flew. Her backup team stormed in, returning fire. The gunmen scattered, but Victor was gone. Monroe and Melissa ran outside just in time to see Victor's car speeding away. Without hesitation, Monroe jumped into her vehicle, Melissa beside her. The tires screeched as they tore after him. The chase was wild. Victor weaved through traffic, running red lights, trying to lose them. But Monroe was relentless. Up ahead, train crossing lights flashed, a train was approaching. Victor pushed the gas, barely making it across the tracks. Monroe had seconds to decide. Melissa screamed, "We won't make it." Monroe slammed the brakes, just as the train thundered past, cutting them off. Victor had escaped. Again. As Monroe and Melissa sat in the stalled car, breathing hard, Monroe's phone buzzed. A message from Victor. "Close call, detective. But you'll never find me. Some things are meant to stay buried." Melissa's hands trembled. "He's still out there." Monroe stared at the text, jaw tight. Not for long. Tears spilled down Jennifer's face. "David, he made a terrible mistake. We were struggling financially. We were drowning in debt. And then one night, he got a call from someone offering a way out." Melissa's stomach twisted. "Selling your own daughter?" Jennifer shook her head violently. "No. That wasn't the plan. David thought it was a private adoption. He swore to me that the people taking you were legitimate. But when you disappeared, and no one could find you, he realized too late what he had done." Monroe's mind raced. "Victor Langley. He manipulated your husband." Jennifer nodded. "David spent years trying to make it right. That's why he was sending money. He was paying Victor to keep him from hurting you. But then, the police reopened the case." Melissa wiped her tears. "And Victor wanted him dead before he could talk." Jennifer sobbed. "He told me if we ever said anything, they'd come for us too." One final move. Monroe's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "You found out too much. You're next." She exhaled. Victor Langley was still out there. And now, it was a race against time. The bitter taste of defeat sat heavy in Monroe's mouth as she and Melissa watched the train thunder past, cutting them off from Victor Langley once again. It had been 30 years since he stole Melissa from her family. And somehow, he was still slipping away. Monroe's hands gripped the steering wheel. The last thing she wanted was to let him disappear, again. Melissa sat frozen in the passenger seat, her heart racing. "He always has an escape plan," she whispered. "How does he do it?" Monroe exhaled sharply. "Because he doesn't work alone. Someone is helping him." The train finally cleared, but by then, Victor's car was long gone. The darkness swallowed the road ahead. No headlights. No tire tracks. Nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Back at the precinct, Monroe's team scrambled to find Victor's escape route. Security cameras from nearby intersections showed something strange. Victor's car had sped through the city, but then it disappeared. The last footage showed it turning down an alleyway behind an old construction site. There were no exits. No other roads. But when officers arrived minutes later, no car. No Victor. Melissa clenched her jaw. He had another vehicle waiting. Monroe nodded. And someone helped him switch. She glanced at the screen again, focusing on the construction site. It had been abandoned for years. But something about it didn't sit right. Then, she saw it. A single faint light flickering inside one of the upper floors. Someone was inside. Monroe turned to Melissa. "Get in the car." The construction site loomed in the night, skeletal and unfinished, a relic of a project long abandoned. Monroe and Melissa crept inside, flashlights cutting through the thick dust. It was too quiet. Melissa whispered, "Are we sure he's still here?" Monroe held up a hand, signaling for silence. Then, a noise. A soft creak above them. Someone was here. They moved cautiously, stepping over broken beams and discarded tools. Then, in the dim light, Monroe saw it. A makeshift living space. A mattress on the floor. A half-empty bottle of whiskey. Stacks of old newspapers. A burner phone. And on the wall, a series of photographs. Melissa's face paled. They were all of her. Everywhere she had been in the last week. Her apartment. The police station. Even the coffee shop she had stopped at that morning. Victor had been watching her. Suddenly, a loud clang. Monroe spun around, gun raised. Footsteps. Fast. Running. She bolted forward, Melissa right behind her. They chased the sound, sprinting up a metal staircase, just in time to see a shadowy figure leap from the third-floor scaffolding. Victor. He hit the ground, rolled, and took off running. Monroe cursed. They were losing him again. Then, without thinking, Melissa grabbed a rusted metal pipe from the floor. And as Victor ran past her, she swung. Hard. The pipe cracked against his ribs. Victor stumbled, then fell. Monroe pounced, pinning him down. "You're done, Langley," she growled. Victor's lip curled into a smile, despite the pain. "Oh, detective," he wheezed. "I think you're forgetting something." And before Monroe could react, he pulled something from his pocket. A detonator. Victor grinned through gritted teeth. "You really thought I'd let you win?" He pressed the button. Boom. The entire building shook violently. Dust exploded into the air. The ground beneath them trembled. Somewhere below, something had detonated. Monroe's ears rang. Victor had rigged the place. And now, it was coming down. Monroe grabbed Melissa's arm. "Run!" They sprinted for the exit as the walls groaned and the ceiling above them began to collapse. Behind them, Victor vanished into the smoke. Again. Monroe and Melissa barely made it out as the building came crashing down behind them. Debris rained from above. A cloud of dust swallowed the street. And Victor? Gone. Melissa coughed, her heart hammering in her chest. How does he keep escaping? Monroe shook her head. She was done underestimating Victor Langley. This time, he had almost killed them. This wasn't just about a decades-old kidnapping anymore. Victor was dangerous. And now, he was desperate. The next morning, Monroe received a call that changed everything. An elderly woman had been pulled from the rubble of the construction site. She was injured, but alive. And when Monroe arrived at the hospital, the woman looked up at her with haunted eyes. "He's coming for me," she whispered. Monroe frowned. "Who?" The woman licked her dry lips. "Victor Langley." Melissa's stomach dropped. "How do you know him?" The woman hesitated. Then, finally, she told them the truth. "I used to work for him." Victor's hidden past. Her name was Margaret Holloway. 30 years ago, she had been a nurse, one who specialized in neonatal care. She had worked at a private hospital. One that, according to her, had a very dark secret. Victor didn't just take Melissa, Margaret whispered. He took others. Melissa's hands clenched into fists. "You're saying there were more kidnapped babies?" Margaret's eyes filled with regret. "Dozens. Maybe more." But I was too scared to ask questions. Monroe's blood ran cold. Where did they go? Margaret's voice dropped. To families who could afford them. Monroe's mind reeled. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a full-scale child trafficking operation. And Victor Langley wasn't working alone. Melissa sat in stunned silence. All these years, she had believed she was one stolen child. But now, she realized something horrifying. She was just one of many. And some of them might still be out there. The truth no one saw coming. Margaret Holloway's confession sent a ripple of shock through Monroe and Melissa. This wasn't just about Melissa anymore. It was about dozens, maybe even hundreds, of stolen children. For 3 decades, Victor Langley had been selling babies. The implications were staggering. Wealthy families, desperate for children, paying secretive sums to adopt infants who were never actually up for adoption. Margaret's hands trembled as she spoke. I never asked questions, she admitted. I just followed orders. But some of those babies, they weren't abandoned. They were stolen. Melissa swallowed hard. You mean like me? Margaret nodded. Exactly like you. Monroe's jaw clenched. And you're saying Victor wasn't working alone? Margaret hesitated. Then she whispered, he was just one piece of a much bigger operation. A web of secrets. Monroe leaned in. Who else was involved? Margaret's lips quivered. Doctors. Nurses. Even social workers. Some of them didn't know the full story. Others? They knew exactly what they were doing. Melissa's mind reeled. How could no one stop this? Margaret sighed. Because the people in charge made sure no one could. Monroe grabbed a notepad. Give me names. Margaret hesitated, then whispered 2 words that made Monroe's stomach drop. Jonathan Coyle. Melissa frowned. Who is that? Monroe exhaled sharply. If this is the same Jonathan Coyle I'm thinking of, he's the CEO of one of the biggest private adoption agencies in the country. Melissa's breath caught. And you think he's part of this? Monroe nodded. It would explain a lot. He's been untouchable for years. Margaret's voice dropped even lower. Because he knows where all the bodies are buried. Monroe's spine stiffened. What do you mean? Margaret met her gaze, eyes hollow. I mean that some of the people who tried to expose this didn't live to tell the story. Nowhere is safe. The weight of Margaret's words settled in the room like a thick fog. Monroe knew what this meant. If Victor had been a soldier in this operation, then Coyle was the general. And now, they had just poked the bear. Melissa's phone vibrated. She glanced at it, then froze. It was an unknown number. And the message was chilling. You're asking too many questions. Stop now, or you'll end up like the others. Melissa's face drained of color. She looked at Monroe. What do we do? Monroe's jaw tightened. We go after them. Detective Monroe didn't waste a second. She gathered her team, pulled records, and started connecting the dots. Jonathan Coyle's adoption agency had handled over 5,000 cases in the last 3 decades. Some of those were legitimate. But many weren't. Melissa sat beside her, scrolling through old news articles. There's nothing linking him to anything illegal. Monroe nodded grimly. That's because he's careful. But then, Melissa found something. A 20-year-old case. A woman named Rachel Ellison had once accused Coyle's agency of stealing her newborn daughter. She had fought for years to prove it. Then, she disappeared. No body. No trace. Just gone. Monroe sat back. She knew something. And Coyle made sure she never talked. Melissa's hands shook. How many people do you think they've silenced? Monroe exhaled. More than we'll ever know. The informant. The next step was risky, but necessary. Monroe reached out to an old contact in the FBI. Someone who had once tried to investigate Coyle before the case mysteriously collapsed. His name was Elliot Grayson. When Monroe called, he answered in a hushed voice. "You don't want to go down this road, Monroe," he warned. "Too late," she replied. Elliot sighed. "Fine. Meet me in an hour. But come alone." Melissa grabbed Monroe's arm. "You're not going by yourself." Monroe hesitated, then relented. "Fine. But stay in the car." The meeting gone wrong. An hour later, Monroe pulled up to an empty parking lot. Elliot was already there, pacing nervously. When Monroe stepped out, he rushed over. "You don't know what you're getting into." "Then tell me," Monroe pressed. Elliot exhaled sharply. "Coyle's operation is bigger than you think. It doesn't just stop at illegal adoptions. It's human trafficking." Monroe felt a chill creep up her spine. "These aren't just stolen babies, Monroe," Elliot continued. "Some of them are never found because they aren't meant to be." Monroe's stomach churned. "Who else is involved?" Elliot hesitated. "Judges. Politicians. Law enforcement. Some of the most powerful people in the country." Before Monroe could react, a gunshot rang out. Elliot's eyes widened. Then, he collapsed. Monroe barely had time to dive for cover. Bullets ripped through the air. From the car, Melissa screamed. Monroe grabbed her gun and fired back, but the shooter was already gone. Elliot lay motionless on the pavement. A single bullet to the head. He had been silenced. A final message. Monroe rushed to the car, yanking the door open. "We have to go. Now." Melissa was shaking. They just killed him." Monroe's phone buzzed. Another unknown number. "That was your last warning. Walk away, detective. Or you'll be next." Monroe's hands clenched into fists. She was done being scared. She was done playing defense. They wanted her to walk away. She was going to burn them down instead. Monroe had been in law enforcement for over a decade, but she had never seen corruption run this deep. Elliot Grayson was dead. Murdered right in front of her. Melissa was still shaking in the passenger seat as they sped away from the scene. "They're going to come after us next, aren't they?" Monroe tightened her grip on the wheel. "Let them try." She knew one thing for sure: they had to act now, or they wouldn't survive long enough to expose the truth. The hidden files. Back at Monroe's apartment, she locked the door and pulled out her laptop. Elliot had risked his life to tell her something. There had to be more. She scoured old case files, digging into every missing baby case tied to Jonathan Coyle's agency. And then, she found it. A hidden account. Large payments made to fake charities, offshore transfers, and shell companies. Millions of dollars funneled through an adoption front. But what made Monroe's blood run cold was a list of names. Judges. Politicians. CEOs. Even law enforcement officials. People who had been protecting Coyle for decades. And at the very bottom of the list? Victor Langley. Melissa gasped. He was working for Coyle this whole time. Monroe clenched her jaw. And we just proved it. The ticking clock. Melissa turned to Monroe. "What do we do with this?" Monroe exhaled sharply. "We take it to someone who can't be bought." But before she could move, the lights in the apartment flickered. Then, the power cut out. Melissa's phone buzzed. Unknown number. One message: too late. Monroe reached for her gun. "We have to get out of here. Now." A black SUV screeched to a stop outside. Doors flew open. Footsteps thundered up the stairs. They were coming. The final stand. Monroe grabbed her laptop and a flash drive. "Go out the back." Melissa hesitated. "What about you?" Monroe looked at her. "I'm finishing this." Before Melissa could argue, Monroe shoved the flash drive into her hand. "Get this to the media. Expose them." Then, the front door burst open. Monroe ducked as gunfire erupted. She fired back, hitting the first man through the door. Another lunged at her, but she swung the laptop bag at his face, knocking him back. More men stormed in. She was outnumbered. But she wasn't going down without a fight. The whole world watching. As Melissa ran, she did the only thing she could: she went live. On every social media platform, she uploaded the files. She posted the names. She exposed everything. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Hashtag Coil Scandal. Hashtag Stolen Babies. Hashtag Justice for Elliot. The media picked it up. News stations aired the evidence. The entire country was watching. The powerful men who had once controlled everything. They were now the hunted. Justice, and the aftermath. When the FBI finally raided Jonathan Coil's estate, they found dozens of forged adoption records, offshore accounts, and evidence of decades of child trafficking. Coil tried to run. He didn't get far. Victor Langley was arrested in his home, his face pale as he realized it was over. Corrupt officials resigned in disgrace. Others were arrested. And as for Monroe, she survived the ambush. Barely. She sat in the hospital, bruised, stitched up, but alive, watching as the world finally knew the truth. Melissa stood beside her, tears in her eyes. "You did it." Monroe gave a small smile. "We did it." The case that took 30 years to solve had finally come to an end. But one thing was certain: the fight for justice was far from over.